A surname that sounds ordinary today may once have belonged to a dynasty powerful enough to decide who wore a crown, who inherited a kingdom, and who disappeared into a prison cell. Some family names survived the castles that created them, crossed national borders, and eventually became ordinary names, carried by people who may never have known why their ancestors used them. But there is an important mystery hidden inside these names. Does sharing a royal surname actually mean you descend from royalty? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes it is much more complicated. And in several cases, the name itself can lead us directly into centuries of executions, disputed thrones, civil wars, marriages between kingdoms, and families determined to preserve their bloodline. The first clue begins with a dynasty whose name became inseparable from the Scottish crown. The surname Stuart, or Stuart in its earlier Scottish form, is one of the clearest examples of a family name connected to European royalty. The word originally had nothing to do with kingship. It came from the office of steward, a powerful administrative position in medieval Scotland. Walter Fitzalan became High Steward of Scotland in the 12th century, and his descendants eventually transformed an official title into a dynastic identity. Centuries later, Robert II became King of Scots in 1371, establishing the Stuart dynasty on the Scottish throne. From that point forward, the family was no longer simply managing the kingdom. They were ruling it. The dynasty produced some of Scotland's most famous monarchs, including Mary, Queen of Scots, whose life became one of the most dramatic royal stories in European history. Her son James VI later inherited the English crown as James I in 1603, bringing the Scottish and English crowns together under one monarch. But the Stuart story contains a warning for anyone researching a surname. Having Stuart in your family tree does not automatically make you descended from the royal branch. The name spread far beyond the immediate royal family, especially among people connected to the original office of steward. The surname survived because the dynasty survived, but that survival created thousands of branches with very different relationships to the throne. And one of those branches leads to a name even more famous in English history. Tudor is a surname that almost seems to announce royalty by itself. Its origins reach back to Wales, where the family name derived from the Welsh personal name Tudor, associated with the medieval Welsh prince Tudor ap Goronwy. The family's rise was extraordinary because it did not begin with an ancient English royal house occupying the throne. It began with Welsh ancestry and a series of political marriages that eventually brought Henry Tudor into direct conflict with Richard III. In 1485, Henry landed in England and defeated Richard at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Richard was killed, and Henry became Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. His descendants would include Henry V and Elizabeth I, two monarchs whose names still dominate popular history. Yet the most fascinating part of the Tudor surname is how quickly royal blood became complicated. Henry V's children inherited different religious and political legacies, while Elizabeth I ended the Tudor line when she died childless in 1603. The dynasty that had reshaped England for more than a century disappeared from the throne, but its surname became immortal. Still, there was an older royal family behind the Tudors, and its name is one of the most recognizable in medieval Europe. Plantagenet is not merely a royal surname. It is the name of one of the longest and most consequential dynastic eras in English history. The dynasty began with Geoffrey of Anjou, whose nickname Plantagenet was associated with the broom plant, or Plantagenista. His son Henry II became King of England in 1154, and the Plantagenet dynasty ruled for generations. Under its kings, England experienced enormous territorial changes, conflicts with France, struggles between monarchs and nobles, and the development of institutions that would shape the future British state. Richard the Lionheart belonged to this dynasty. So did King John, whose reign became associated with Magna Carta in 1215. Later Plantagenet rulers included Edward III and Richard II, but the family eventually fractured into rival branches, most famously Lancaster and York. Those two names became symbols of one of England's bloodiest internal conflicts, the Wars of the Roses. And this is where a surname stops being just a family label and becomes a map of political history. Lancaster carries a royal association that reaches directly into the Plantagenet family. The House of Lancaster descended from John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the son of Edward III. When Henry IV seized the English throne in 1399, the Lancastrian branch became royal. Henry V, the famous warrior king who defeated the French at Agincourt, was a Lancaster monarch. His son Henry VI inherited the crown, but struggled to control a kingdom increasingly divided by rival nobles. The resulting Wars of the Roses eventually destroyed Lancastrian political dominance. Yet the name survived. That survival is important, because surnames can outlive the political institutions that created them. Modern people named Lancaster are not automatically descended from the royal house of Lancaster. The surname also developed from places associated with Lancaster and from ordinary geographical naming. But for genealogists, the name can still be a valuable clue because it points toward a historical landscape where powerful families once competed for the English crown. And on the opposite side of that conflict stood another famous royal name. York became royal through another branch of the Plantagenet family. The House of York descended from Edward III through his son Edmund of Langley, Duke of York. During the Wars of the Roses, Yorkist forces challenged the Lancastrian claim to the throne. Edward IV eventually became king in 1461, beginning a period of Yorkist rule. His brother Richard III became king after him in 1483, but Richard's reign lasted only 2 years. In 1485, Henry Tudor defeated him at Bosworth, ending the Yorkist period and beginning the Tudor era. The story became even more mysterious because Richard III's young nephews, Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, disappeared from public view after being confined in the Tower of London. Their fate remains one of the enduring mysteries of English history. Yet the surname York itself is much older and much broader than the royal house. Many people who bear it have no connection whatsoever to the dynasty. The name can simply indicate geographic origin. That distinction matters because royal surnames often became ordinary surnames through completely separate pathways, and sometimes the royal connection crossed an entire continent. Few surnames are more strongly associated with European royalty than Bourbon. The House of Bourbon originated as a branch of the French Capetian dynasty. Its rise to the French throne came through Henry of Navarre, who became Henry IV of France in 1589. His accession followed the French Wars of Religion, a period of intense conflict between Catholics and Protestants. Henry converted to Catholicism, famously associated with the pragmatic statement that Paris was worth a mass, although the exact wording and circumstances have been debated. The Bourbon dynasty later produced Louis XIII, Louis XIV, and Louis XV, before the monarchy was overthrown during the French Revolution. Louis XVI, the last Bourbon king of France before the revolutionary abolition of the monarchy, was executed by guillotine in 1793. The family survived the revolution, however, and Bourbon branches continued to rule elsewhere. Spanish monarchs also belonged to the Bourbon dynasty, demonstrating how a single royal house could extend beyond one country's borders. But even Bourbon ancestry has to be proven through genealogy rather than assumed from the surname alone. Royal dynasties created many cadet branches, and surnames were adopted, changed, translated, or abandoned over time. The next name makes that problem even more dramatic. Habsburg became synonymous with power across Europe for centuries. The family's origins can be traced to the Habsburg castle in what is now Switzerland, but their influence expanded enormously through strategic marriage, inheritance, and political alliances. Maximilian I strengthened the dynasty through marriage to Mary of Burgundy, while his descendants accumulated territories across Europe. The Habsburgs eventually ruled the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, Austria, Hungary, and other territories. Charles V, who became Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, controlled an enormous collection of lands stretching across Europe and overseas possessions. The family became famous for marrying within a relatively narrow circle of European dynasties. a practice that helped preserve political alliances, but also produced serious hereditary problems. One of the most famous examples was Charles II of Spain, whose physical and medical difficulties were associated with generations of close dynastic marriages. He died childless in 1700, triggering a succession crisis that led to the War of the Spanish Succession. The Habsburg name therefore tells a story not only of royal ancestry, but of how concentrated power could eventually become a biological and political liability. Another surname points toward a dynasty that ruled Britain for much of the 18th and 19th centuries, Hanover. The House of Hanover came to the British throne in 1714 when George I succeeded Queen Anne. The succession was shaped by the Protestant settlement established after the political crises of the 17th century. George I was born and raised in the German territories of the Holy Roman Empire, and his arrival placed a German-speaking dynasty on the British throne. His descendants included George II, George III, George IV, and William IV. George III's reign was particularly significant because it spanned the American Revolution, the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, and enormous political change in Britain. Yet the Hanoverian name eventually disappeared from the British throne. Queen Victoria was the last British monarch of the House of Hanover. In 1840, she married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and their descendants eventually carried the dynastic name Windsor. This is where surnames become especially deceptive. Royal families can change dynastic names while the bloodline continues. A name can disappear, even though the ancestry remains. Romanov is perhaps the most haunting surname on this list. The Romanov dynasty ruled Russia from 1613 until the Revolution of 1917. Michael Romanov became Tsar after the Time of Troubles, a period of political chaos, famine, foreign intervention, and competing claims to power. His dynasty eventually produced Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and Nicholas II. Under the Romanovs, Russia expanded into one of the world's largest empires. But the dynasty's final chapter was catastrophic. Nicholas II abdicated in 1917 after revolution and military disaster had shattered confidence in the imperial government. He, his wife Alexandra, their children, and several attendants were later executed by Bolshevik forces in 1918. For decades, uncertainty surrounded the fate of the imperial children, especially the famous legend that Grand Duchess Anastasia had survived. Modern forensic and archaeological evidence has established the fate of the Romanov family, ending the most famous survival theories. Yet Romanov descendants exist today through surviving branches of the wider family. Again, the surname alone is not proof. Royal genealogy is a chain of documented relationships, not a romantic assumption based on a familiar name. And then there is Capet, a name that reaches even farther back. Hugh Capet became king of the Franks in 987, beginning what became the Capetian dynasty. His descendants ruled France, directly or through branches, for centuries. The Capetians produced the Valois and Bourbon dynasties, meaning that some of the most famous French royal houses were ultimately connected to the same dynastic family. Hugh Capet himself was not an absolute monarch in the modern sense. Medieval kings had to negotiate with powerful nobles whose territories could rival the royal domain. The remarkable achievement of the Capetians was continuity. Generation after generation, the dynasty strengthened its position, expanded royal authority, and developed a hereditary tradition that eventually made the French monarchy one of Europe's most powerful institutions. The Capetian story also reveals why royal ancestry can be surprisingly widespread. Because European royal families repeatedly married into other noble houses, descendants could eventually appear in many different populations. A person may be separated from a medieval monarch by dozens of generations and still possess a genuine genealogical connection. But proving that connection requires records, not simply a surname. That brings us to the strangest truth about royal last names. A surname is a clue, but it is not a royal certificate. In medieval Europe, surnames could come from occupations, villages, nicknames, titles, fathers, or places. Some royal dynasties did not even use surnames in the modern sense. Monarchs could be identified by their given name and regnal number, while dynastic names were created or popularized later. Other families adopted prestigious names because they were connected to a powerful institution without descending directly from its ruling branch. And royal families themselves frequently changed names through marriage, inheritance, political necessity, or national transformation. The real surprise is how much royal ancestry may exist without any famous surname at all. European aristocratic and royal families were interconnected through centuries of marriage, meaning that genealogical descendants of medieval monarchs can be far more numerous than popular culture suggests. A person does not need to carry Tudor, Stuart, Bourbon, or Romanov as a last name to have a royal ancestor. In fact, the further back the ancestor lived, the more descendants that individual can potentially have today. What looks like an ordinary family tree may contain connections to kings, queens, princes, and noble houses whose names vanished generations ago. So when someone discovers a surname associated with a royal dynasty, the correct reaction is not to declare royal blood. It is to investigate, find the earliest documented ancestor carrying the name, identify where that person lived, compare birth, marriage, land, church, census, probate, and court records. Over the Loire are blown out. The only hope now is that the fighting stops. Over the Loire are blown out. The only hope now is that the fighting stops. Over the Loire are blown out. The only hope now is that the fighting stops. Over the Loire are blown out. Then a family legend. It becomes history supported by evidence. Because surnames do something extraordinary. They preserve fragments of worlds that no longer exist. Stuart recalls a Scottish office that became a throne. Tudor recalls a Welsh family that conquered England's crown. Plantagenet opens the door to medieval kings and civil war. Lancaster and York reveal a kingdom divided against itself. Bourbon carries the memory of France's greatest monarchy and its revolutionary collapse. Habsburg evokes an empire built through marriage. Hanover reveals how a foreign dynasty inherited Britain. Romanov recalls the final days of Imperial Russia, and Capet reaches back to the foundation of a royal tradition that shaped France for centuries. The name on your family tree may not prove that a king or queen is waiting somewhere in your ancestry, but it might point toward a forgotten place, an extinct dynasty, an old political office, or a branch of a family that once stood remarkably close to the center of history. And sometimes the most powerful discovery is not finding out that your ancestor wore a crown. It is discovering that someone ordinary in your family tree once stood close enough to one to leave a trace that survived for centuries. If your family name has a story worth discovering, subscribe for more forgotten history.